In 2009, a journalist from the Los Angeles Times drove to a quiet street in Pasadena, California, to fact-check something she had seen on the internet and assumed was an exaggeration. The claim was that a single family, on a residential lot in the middle of a suburb, was producing over 6,000 pounds of food per year. She knocked on the door at 657 Urbana Drive. She was not prepared for what she found. The front yard was vegetables. The backyard was vegetables. The raised beds were stacked with produce, the fences were covered in climbing beans, and there were chickens and ducks moving through it all with the casual confidence of animals that had lived there for years. Jules Dervais, a soft-spoken man in his early 60s, walked her through the property and showed her his records. 12 years of meticulous harvest logs, variety lists, revenue figures. The numbers weren't exaggerated. On less than a quarter of an acre, a lot smaller than most American backyards, this family built something that agricultural researchers said shouldn't be possible. This is the story of how they did it, what it cost them, and why almost nobody knows their name. Jules Dervais did not start as a farmer. He started as a Catholic convert in Florida in the early 1980s, working a conventional job, raising 4 children with his wife, living what he later described as a completely ordinary American life. Then he read a pastoral letter, a document issued by the Catholic bishops, that described modern industrial civilization as spiritually corrosive. That document changed everything. He didn't become an environmentalist. He didn't join a movement. He made a private, deeply personal decision that his family was going to stop depending on systems they couldn't see or control. He moved them to Pasadena in 1985, into a rented house on Urbana Drive, and he started digging. The lot was 1/10 of an acre of usable growing space. Most people look at that and see a backyard. Jules looked at it and saw a farm. He tore out the lawn. He built raised beds. He planted fruit trees along the fence lines. He added chickens for eggs, ducks for pest control, goats for milk, rabbits for meat. He started composting everything organic that entered the property and returning it to the soil. He saved seeds. He mapped the sun angles across every season to maximize light capture on every square foot. By the early 2000s, the operation had reached a scale that started attracting attention. The Path to Freedom website, his documentation of the project, was drawing millions of visitors per year. People who wanted to believe that self-sufficiency was still possible in a suburban neighborhood found in Jules Dervais a living proof of concept. 6,000 pounds of food per year, 400 plant varieties, $20,000 in annual food value from a lot that most Pasadena neighbors were using to park a second car. The restaurants came next. Local chefs started showing up at the property. Restaurants in Pasadena began sourcing specialty greens, edible flowers, and heirloom vegetables directly from the Dervais farm. The family was selling surplus at the farmers market and delivering to restaurant accounts. They were operating a functioning small agricultural business from a residential lot in the middle of a city, and they were doing it while eating, primarily from the same land. And then Pasadena noticed. The city's code enforcement received complaints. The front yard, which Jules had converted to intensive vegetable production, violated residential landscaping ordinances that effectively required conventional lawns or ornamental planting. He was told to remove the food garden. He refused. What followed was a prolonged public conflict between a single family and their city government over the right to grow vegetables in their own front yard, a conflict that the family documented in real time, and that drew national attention in ways nobody anticipated. Local news covered it. Then, national outlets picked it up. Then, urban agriculture advocates across the country got involved. The Dervais case became the most visible flashpoint in a growing movement pushing for municipal policy reform on urban food production. People who had never heard of Jules Dervais before were writing letters to the Pasadena City Council. Agricultural policy researchers were citing the case in academic papers, and eventually, the city backed down. That victory didn't just protect the farm on Urbana Drive. It contributed directly to the legislative groundwork for California's AB 2561, passed in 2014, which made it explicitly illegal for California cities to prohibit edible gardens on residential properties. A family in Pasadena, fighting their city over a vegetable garden, helped change state law. That is not an exaggeration. That is what happened. But here's what the inspiring version of this story doesn't tell you, and this is where it gets complicated. The Dervais farm wasn't Jules working alone. It was Jules and his 4 adult children, Anais, Jordan, Justin, and Distance, who had grown up on the property, who had built the raised beds and managed the animals and maintained the harvest records and run the farmer's market booth and written the blog and answered the emails and filmed the videos. The path to freedom wasn't one man's project. It was a family operation in the fullest sense, run by people who had dedicated their adult lives to it without, according to their own later accounts, any financial stake in the entity that bore the Dervais name. In 2011, 3 of Jules's children left the property and went public. The accounts they published online described a household run with authoritarian rigidity, where Jules made unilateral decisions about the family's finances, relationships, and daily lives. Where the children's labor built something they had no legal ownership over, where dissent was not tolerated, where years of work had produced an organization, the Dervais Institute, that Jules controlled entirely, and that had accumulated significant assets from donations, speaking fees, and media attention. The urban farming community, which had celebrated this family as a model of cooperative, values-driven living, was confronted with a story that looked very different from the inside. Followers divided. Long-running supporters removed the farm from their blog rolls. The comment sections of urban homesteading websites became battlegrounds between people who believed Jules and people who believed his children. And then Jules made it worse. In February 2011, the Dervais Institute filed trademark claims on the phrases urban homestead and urban homesteading. These were not obscure terms. They were the generic language that thousands of bloggers, authors, community gardens, and organizations across the country used to describe their own work. The Dervais Institute began sending cease and desist letters to anyone using those phrases online, including a library in California that had scheduled an event called an urban homesteading workshop. The backlash was unlike anything the urban agriculture community had produced before. Facebook groups organized, bloggers published open letters, libraries and community gardens held urban homestead events specifically to defy the trademark. The story reached NPR, the Los Angeles Times, and dozens of national publications. The message was unanimous. You cannot trademark a way of life. You cannot own a movement that existed before you named it, and will exist after you're gone. The trademark was eventually challenged through the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Its practical enforcement collapsed entirely as the legal and public pressure mounted, but the damage was done. The man who had spent 2 decades building a model of self-sufficient community living had spent the final years of his public life trying to own the words that described it. Jules Dervais died in February 2016. He was 69 years old. His daughter Anais continued operating the farm after his death, and the property on Urbana Drive continued producing food. The Path to Freedom website remained online. The harvest records, 12 years of meticulous documentation, showing what a family had built on a 1/4 acre, stayed there, available to anyone who looked. What survives from this story is genuinely complicated. The achievement was real. 6,000 pounds from 1/10 of an acre is real. The legal victory that contributed to protecting urban gardens across California is real. The research that cited the Dervais operation as evidence that suburban food production at scale was possible, that is real too. None of it was undone by what came after, but neither was what came after. The children who built it with their hands and left with nothing. The community that was told it could not use its own words. The gap between the values someone teaches and the way they actually live. None of that disappears because the farm itself was extraordinary. The most honest reading of 657 Urbana Drive is that both things are true at the same time. That a family built something remarkable, and that building it cost more than it should have, in ways that were never on the harvest record. What the property proved What the numbers confirmed, and the researchers documented, and California law eventually acknowledged, is that the quarter-acre most people are using for lawn and ornamental shrubs is capable of feeding a family, and then some, if the person looking at it decides to see it differently. That idea does not belong to Jules Gervais. It never did. It belongs to anyone willing to pick up a shovel and start measuring what is possible on the ground they already have. If you want to know exactly which crops and systems produce the highest yields in that kind of space, the specific plants that perform best in small footprint intensive production, the next video covers the 8 that show up consistently in every high output small garden, and why most people growing food at home are missing the most productive one entirely.